Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you about such a fascinating subject, and that is the gratitude of the awesomeness of the endless capacity of the mind. In wanting to talk about this, have been working in surgery and with the brain for some 50 years. And I am so impressed with its capabilities, its durability, its plasticity, and how amazing the brain is in producing the mind. Bruce R. McConkie said, "The sentinel, conscious, and intelligent part of man, the part that perceives, feels, wills, and thinks, is called the mind. To those who rule an omnipotent creator out of their views, who suppose that all things exist by mere evolutionary change, the mind of man is an inexplicable mystery. But to those who know about God and his eternal purposes, it is clear that the mind of man rests in the eternal spirit. The mind was present with the pre-existent spirit. It will be present with the disembodied spirit in the sphere immediately following mortality. Man's intelligence is in his spirit and not in the natural or mortal body." So, how is it that mankind over a period of time has tried to come to grips with what the brain and the mind does? An early attempt was what was called phrenology. In phrenology, they drew pictures of the head, and as you see in this slide, and show where they thought certain functions were. The purpose of this class is to have each member understand that the greatest unique gift from God is our individual spiritual and physical brain, our mind. Now, there are obviously genetic differences in minds, in brains. In fact, we have the same genes as approximately 70% as a piece of corn. And if we go up the so-called evolutionary scale to the primate, more than 99% of our genes are the same as primates. And if we look at identical twins, less than 1 in 10,000 genes are different. So how is it that we explain the amazing difference between every human and a primate, and even the differences between identical twins? The difference is, of course, the spirit. Everybody's spirit is different. And each one of us has a unique spirit which was created from an intelligence organized as a spirit, and then through the progression of time developed characteristics prior to us coming to earth, and then the differences in genes, the differences in lifestyle and environment has made each one of us a very unique individual. Now, the brain is amazingly complex. It develops, as you can see, from 2 cells, and it ends up in a very complex structure with approximately 90 billion neurons and over 100 trillion connections between those neurons. And that does not include all of the glial cells, which are the support cells of the brain. So the equivalent that we can talk about the complexity of the brain versus the complexity of what the brain has produced on Earth is compared to the most complex structure on Earth, which is an aircraft carrier, which takes 6 years to produce and has 7 million parts, in comparison to the brain, which starts to develop from day one of gestation and is essentially an organ by 8 weeks, and then continues to develop new cells and to prune some cells throughout life. There are obviously very complex developmental functions that each person goes through, from obviously having the innate functions such as being able to nurse, and to go on to obviously a lot of the senses are already present, and then to go on with more complex structures of locomotion and the most complex part of the brain, which is speech. Now, attempts have been made to try and make models of the brain. So right now, the most complex computer that is on the face of the earth is the equivalent of about a thumbnail of brain. So we are not even close to developing a brain, and probably it will take until 2035 to even come close, but it will never explain all of the differences, the developmental capacities, and the uniqueness of each brain. So the brain is divided into parts. It's divided into larger parts, which we call lobes, and each one of them has a function. If we look at the phrenology scale, here's a picture of the brain. So we have the lobes. We have the frontal lobe, which is responsible for complex associations. And then we have the temporal lobe, which is responsible for emotions. The parietal lobe, which is responsible for sensations. The occipital lobe, responsible for vision and visual association. The cerebellum, responsible for fine motor control. And the brainstem, which are all of the automated functions, which we don't have to think about, such as sweat, how fast our heart beats, and all these things. So if we go beyond that, then there are functional parts of the brain that perform certain functions. For instance, in this picture, there are 2 parts of the brain responsible for speech. One of them is the motor speech area, and the other is the sensory speech area. And each one of those performs its proper function. And of course, there's areas responsible for motor function, for sensation, for the interpretation of all the senses. And as we go further down the functional scale, we have columns of cells. Those columns of cells are usually anywhere between 100 and 300 cells, and they perform a very specific function. And then we obviously have the individual neurons. As mentioned, there are close to 100 million neurons which are connected, and all of these neurons have connection with other neurons, which are synapses. And synapses are where the really functional unit of the brain is located, and there are chemical changes that take place in all of these synapses with memory and with learning, and that is where information is stored. So the one question that everybody should ask is, obviously, when each one of us dies, all of those cells don't work anymore, but yet the information and the experiences we've had in our life continue on. So these are obviously transmitted to our intellect, to our spiritual brain, to our intelligence, which continues on after death. So the reason why we have all these synapses is they're constantly adapting, and as we develop new experiences, these synapses are being pruned, and they're also being magnified and intensified so that we can have very vivid experiences and keep them with us for a very long period of time. Now, all this essentially is for one purpose. The purpose is for us to develop those experiences, to have those experiences, to develop those relationships, and to develop the intellect and the abilities which will allow us to continue on and become, as our Heavenly Father desires of us, to become like Him. So really the most important thing in our life is to choose those experiences, to develop those relationships, and to make those covenants which will prepare us for the eternities. Now, what is it that keeps a brain healthy? I mean, the brain obviously is a very specialized structure and has certain demands. In fact, the brain uses 25% of all of the oxygen in the blood that is carried to the body, even though it's less than 3% of the weight. So it's a very thirsty and needy organ. One thing that's very interesting about the brain is that most cells in the rest of the body can either live on fat or protein, but the brain can only live on sugar. And that, of course, when people have blackouts, particularly when they have diabetes and take too much insulin and their sugar drops, then they can not only have seizures but become unconscious, because the brain needs a steady flow of sugar. So all disease processes normally come from three different methodologies. It's either genetic, it's lifestyle, or environment. So the question is, can the mind or the spiritual part of our brain become ill? And obviously the mind, our spiritual part, has certain needs which we'll discuss at much greater length. So it's critical to be able to protect our brain physically and also mentally, because our brain is like a great sponge. It will take everything in. Now, obviously, the brain does not have a particular filter, and so we have to externally create a filter so that what we take into our brain is healthy, not only physically healthy, but spiritually healthy. As mentioned, the brain can only live on sugar, so we have to have a steady source of sugar, but it doesn't have to be processed sugar. It can obviously be natural forms of sugar, such as fructose, which is fruit sugar. Now, the brain is very complex, and one of the major components of the brain is actually fat. Fat acts as the insulator between the innumerable neurons in the brain, and so our brain, if you put it on a scale, weighs about 3 pounds, but if you put it in water, it only weighs about 2 ounces. That is, it can almost float, and that's because of the high fat content of the myelin, which is the insulator part of the brain. Obviously, protein is extremely important because that's what allows for all of the important metabolic functions of the brain to occur, all the way from the synapses to the dendrites, which are the connections between neurons, and the axon, which carries the input away from the neuron to an adjacent area. Some of the neurons can be very long, extending from one part of the brain to another, and some of them can be very short. But protein is extremely important for maintaining the integrity of the cell wall of the neuron and all of its functions. Of course, everybody has the major question, and that is, what about aging? And what about developing Alzheimer's? How is that related to the capacity of the mind and of the brain? We talk about the fact that the capacity is endless in reality, and yet we still have to go through mortality and its implicit difficulties and challenges, including deterioration. So, is deterioration of the brain inevitable? The answer is yes and no. And that is that there are certain processes in our body that do slow down, but one can be vigorous mentally and physically to far into the 90s and beyond. Our example, of course, in the present day is President Nelson, being 93 years old, and he can still ski. And obviously he's physically active and very mentally active and engaged. So what is it that allows this to happen? Somebody once said, you cannot outrun your genes, which is true. And that is, each one of us have a set of genes which determine to some extent how long we're going to live and what problems we are going to have during life. Many people are exposed to cancer or other forms of illness, and of course deterioration of the brain, Alzheimer's. So what is it that brings Alzheimer's on? Well, part of it, of course, is genetics, and there's a certain group of people, if you have a certain gene, you have a 4 times the risk of developing Alzheimer's as people that don't have it. So there is obviously some genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's. But there are many other things as well. And that is, we talked about having a healthy brain. Well, a healthy brain is partly to help us and prevent Alzheimer's. And so what is that? Well, there are certain things that have been well shown, and that is that the more you use your brain, the less likely it's going to deteriorate, kind of that you have reserve. And so people that are actively engaged in studying, learning new tasks, learning new things such as new experiences, new languages, new hobbies, new endeavors, are much less likely to develop Alzheimer's. Those that have good relationships, and that is a good, strong family relationship, it's less likely to be the case. So it behooves us to be essentially all of our lives to be learners of spiritual things, learners of physical things, learners of new challenges. The brain likes challenges. It doesn't like being sedentary. It doesn't like only having the same input. Just like if we did the same thing all the time, then we would get bored of it. And the brain is the same thing. So by having new experiences and new challenges, you create new synapses. You create the synapses become more developed, and those experiences go more to the forefront. So each one of us must, throughout our whole life, spend the time, that is the physical time exercising. It's been well proven that exercise decreases the risk of Alzheimer's. Doing mental exercises, crossword puzzles, new languages, new challenges, and having good relationships, spending time with people which will stimulate, again, synapses in our brain. So all of these things are expressing gratitude for the amazing abilities of the brain, which science is only beginning to touch. But the science of the brain is really the science of the mind, the intellect, the intelligence. And each one of us were created from an intelligence, and by developing that intelligence, it says that we'll have so much the advantage in the world to come. So I hope that we can spend time together in talking about the awesomeness of the mind and the endless capacity is available to each of us if we are willing to spend the time and the effort to do it. I hope that I can have the opportunity to be able to spend this time with you and go through all of the possibilities of using our brain, and what a beautiful, eternal, and God-given creation our spiritual brain is, our mind, and the physical body that we have received through our physical parents, and the spiritual body that we have received through Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother. Thank you.